Hello, I am going to be presenting what I have for my Unreal project. Now, I wasn't able to get working in VR. The hardware just wasn't working. I ran into a lot of issues. However, I'm still really proud with the progress that I made on this project, and I want to show off some of the key mechanics and what I learned during the course of this final project. First and foremost, the game again is just a memory game, Simon Says game, where you, the player, stand in the middle. And after clicking this cube here, as it says in the instructions, it'll start playing a musical sequence where each one of these keys will play a note from C all the way up the octave up to B. And it'll also glow green in case you're not too good with music. You can have a visual indicator also telling you where it is. This was going to take the affordances that VR gives by making it a radial design. That way you would have to use the spatial audio cues in order to know which one is being used, in addition to the actual pitch of the key itself, which in this little outliner here says which key it is, and one of the properties is a sound cue attached to it, which represents that given note. And don't know if there's audio here, but we can see that we have a sound cue for each one of them with volume attenuation with an inner radius which is more than the size of the circle itself so that you don't lose it, and a fall off distance thereafter. That way you can tell which direction the sound's coming from, and also have the pitch cues as well as the green glowing, all of which will tell you which key is the correct one. And I can play it, and yeah, it would work over. And next, we have a score and a high score. A high score obviously only changing if you beat your previous high score. And this welcome message, which would go away as soon as you clicked on the cube. Now, with that said, I want to take a look at the blueprints that I worked on, as this is much different than what I'm used to working with in Unity, but I was actually pleasantly surprised with how it functions. First and foremost, we have our game manager, which this will handle the sequence of notes in a row and also keep track of the current inputs that we give when we click on the piano keys to try replicating it. Uh, and we'll take a moment and we'll take a look in a moment to see how that code actually plays out. But we also have a blueprint class for the piano key itself, which would just store it being able to change color, either green if you get it right or red if you get it wrong, and then after a short delay, change it back. This class also holds a variable which represents which note we're using, where 0 is the lowest note, C, and then 11 would be the highest note, B. Um, and it only goes up one octave, otherwise we would have a lot more keys over here, and the game I think would be just a little bit too unwieldy. And then last but not least, we have our interface. That way we can communicate between the piano key and the game manager, um, as well as have blueprint-wide events. Now with that said, I'm going to open up this right here. And I'm also going to minimize and I'll grab the piano key itself. Now, I'll look at the piano key first because this one is a lot simpler. So first things first, we have our three color changing scripts. Change color, which just takes our cube right here, which is the actual key, and changes its material to something called on material, which is this green material here. We also have off material, which is that white color, and then the wrong material, which is red. And both change color, or I guess change color, change back, and change wrong color all do pretty much that. Now with that said, I'm also going to look at the event graph, as this is a bit more interesting. First off, we have our submit key here, which would have been used particularly when we were operating the VR pawn, and that would work with our raycasting. When it's triggered, however, it checks to see if you're allowed to click the piano keys or not, as if the game's in the middle of playing the sequence that you would have to repeat, uh, we wouldn't want the player to be able to try clicking everything as they come in. Otherwise, that kind of defeats the point. the game in making a memory game. But if you can, in fact, click, it goes to the game manager and sends that key value, so that variable that represents what node is, to the game manager itself. This game manager is also assigned inside of the scene. It's called the Simon Says manager. And then over here, we have play key and play wrong key, which not only does that play our sound using the spatial audio at the key's location, but then it also changes the color, and then after a half-second delay, changes it back to its original color. And then last but not least, we have in-play mode, which is whether or not it's playing that original sequence that you'd have to repeat, and then outplay mode. And all that does is change whether or not you're able to click it at a given time. Where if it's currently playing back to you, you shouldn't be able to click, and then when it finishes, you can click once more. And with that said, let's take a look over at the game manager. Now, this is a little bit more complicated, but we'll look at the event manager first, since it's the easiest part. First, you have that same submit key, so when you go to click it with the trigger of the VR controller, it's going to see if you can start the game or not. So if click to start's true, that means you haven't started the game yet, so you should be able to click on the cube. And on doing so, it gets rid of that explanation message, so it's not hanging there the whole game, makes it so you can't click anymore. And then afterwards, plays the first sequence, which will just be one note at the time, but will grow as the game goes on. And then over here, we have send key value, which was called over in the piano key. All it does is it takes that value from the piano key, sends it to the game manager, and then checks to see if that key is right at that given spot in the sequence or not. Moving on from there, oh, we have our construction, which this looks really complicated, and realistically, this was my first time working with blueprints, but I can break it down pretty easily by this one just picking a random number from 0 to 11, and then inputting it as the first element of the index with the size to fit box checked off so that it can grow as the game goes on. Meanwhile, as it goes on, it's going to increase the last array index to 0. That way it knows when to stop, pretty much. It sets click to start true. That way you can start the game whenever you're ready. But it also sets our current index and the scores all equal to 0. We also are able to disable clicking, which just means the player can't play around with the keys normally. And then it also sets the explanation to our original text here. And that's why it shows up on our end, which I'm happy to say proves that was working. As changing this text here would then inherently change the text over in the scene. And then over here, this just changes the score text and high score text back to saying score or high score, and then the initial starting score, which is always 0. And yeah, that's the construction method. Next, we'll have the play sequence, which all that does, it uses a for each loop to go through every element in the sequence, which is just the number in the sequence that we're grabbing. And then in the array that represents all of the piano keys, it grabs that given number from the sequence, which would really represent what note it is, and then it would just play that key. So then it would go through the interface, change its color, play the note, all that fun stuff, and get the game loop going. Over here, we have check key, which I mentioned before, but all it does, it checks if your input key value, so when you click a piano key, is the correct one at that point in the sequence represented here. And then it'll send that over to this if else branch. If it's true, if you played the right key, then the next thing that's going to do, it's going to play that key again. It'll make it green, giving the user positive feedback before checking to see if you've reached the end of the array or not. If you did reach the end of the index, then it's going to add a new key to the index, and then it'll set your current index, so the one you're trying to guess to for, all the way back. All the way back to 0. Or actually, oh, no, sorry. When it's false, that means it doesn't have to set it back to 0, so it just adds 1 to it so you can guess the next thing in the sequence. Apologies there. And then last but not least, if you got it wrong, it's first going to play the wrong key, so it makes it red, so you know you got it wrong. and then it resets the whole game. And all the reset does is it sets all the values except for high score back to 0, and then it gives this little game over text. All right, and with that, we have our add key method, which all the add key method does is it grabs the last array index, increases it by 1, then picks a random number again and tacks it on to the end, making sure to change the size of the array. That way it doesn't get an out of bounds error. And then it updates the score text because the only time you add a key is when you get something right. So then you add one to the score, update the text itself to represent that, and then maybe update the high score if you beat your last high score, doing the same thing there. And with that said, that sums up all this. And then last but not least, I'm going to minimize, go to the content drawer, and then if we look inside our blueprints for the VR, I can open up the VR pawn, which represents our player. Now, given I wasn't able to properly show this off because my VR headset just wasn't working, but I can show the code that I was implementing down here, where we have our motion controller's right aim, and you grab its world location as well as its forward vector, which that would be our raycast, and it sets it forward 1,000 in a direction, and more or less it has it start a world location and then go 1,000 forward from that world location. Anything along that would count as a hit, and when we have a hit, we basically grab the actor or the key that we would want to hit from that, or even the cube, and all we do is we call that submit key from our interface, which then would run all the code that we just mentioned and then finish the project. But with that said, sorry again that I couldn't get this to work. I was really excited to, but overall, I think I learned a lot about how Unreal Engine works, how blueprints work, and the differences between Unity and Unreal Engine. An unintended consequence of this course, but one that I'm always going to welcome. All right, but with that said, thank you so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.